Hello everybody, this is this week's class. I apologise for it being a little bit late this week. I had some technical issues, but here we go. We'll give it a go. So this week's lecture is on codes of practice and communication. It's the start of your second assignment. I've met you before through this format, but in case you can't remember who I am, my name is Penelope Ross, and I am a lecturer lecturing health and social care from the Coleraine campus. Please forgive me, this is only my fourth time at recording a lecture, so I apologise if there's shuffling of papers and all sorts of things going on in the background. I'll try and do it as best as I can. My background is in nursing, so I'm not going to apologise for the fact that this short lecture is looking quite closely at the nursing code of conduct. You will be able to, after listening to this, you will be able to look further down the DLE page and you will find some links to other codes that you can look at. So for all you budding social workers out there, there might be the odd other code for you to look at as well. Ideally, guys, you will all, and I mean all of you on all different campuses, will join in the forum activity. Okay, and the idea of this is that you might look at a component of another code or even this code, and you might try to explain via a forum how you think these components of the codes impact on communication in health and social care. So here are your learning outcomes for this session. Hopefully by the end of this session you should be able to list some of the components of the Nursing and Midwifery Code of Practice. That's what the NMC stands for. It's quite interesting that as a nurse I've already resorted to the use of abbreviations, but a bit more of that later on. You should be able to select aspects of this code and apply them to your own workplace environment. And you should be able to, with a little bit of luck, be able to explain how the Nurse and Midwifery Code of Practice impacts on the communication process in health and social care, which, let's face it, this is why you're all listening to this lecture in the first place. And this is why, of course, on your second assignment you have a learning outcome 2.2, and this learning outcome asks you to explain how legislation, charters and codes of practice impact on the communication process in health and social care. So guys, I suppose the first thing you really should do is try and find for yourself a definition of legislation, charters and codes of practice. You'll be delighted to know I'm going to tell you the definition of codes of practice in a wee minute. But you need to understand the difference. There is differences between these three words, okay, and the differences between legislation, charters and codes actually does make a difference then how these impact on your day-to-day working practice in health and social care. If you can imagine, if it was a law or legislation and you failed to follow the letter of the law, then you too could find yourself in a jail. Definitely 100% so. For the purposes of this lecture though, I'm going to concentrate on codes of practice first. So now then, before we go on, we'll have a look at the command verb. I think Moira's already said before that your command verbs for every assignment, very, very important. This command verb for this section of your assignment asks you to explain. You've got to explain something. And so a quick reminder as to what that means for level 4. And that means you've got to provide sufficient detail and or understanding in your written responses in this case. So one of the wee tips I can give you is that you can use linkage words, such as therefore, so that, and because, to expand on the initial point you're making in your written work. So when you concentrate on an aspect of this code of practice, you could quote the code or the bit of the code, and then you can say that we are following this code because, or we're following this code so that. Hopefully you'll be saying so that the communication process in health and social care is improved, and therefore patient outcomes themselves will improve. That's the sort of thing that you've got to write about. So first things first then, guys. I'm going to give you a definition then of a code or a code of practice. And here's your definition. Feel free, you can have this free of charge. A code of practice states the standards of behaviour and professional practice required of health and social care practitioners. These are set and monitored by professional bodies such as the GMC, which is the General Medical Council for Doctors, the NMC, which is the Nursing Midwifery Council for Nurses, or here in Northern Ireland, the NISCC, which is the Northern Irish Social Care Council. And all of these professional bodies publish codes of practice that they require their the practitioners to adhere to. Now then, as a nurse, I can tell you that our code of practice as a nurse it literally underpins every single thing we do in nursing. So if somebody came into A&E and they needed to be resuscitated, you can bet your bottom dollar that our code of practice will underpin that. If somebody comes into an outpatients department to see a rheumatologist, the nurse on duty will be all of her actions in terms of welcoming the patient to the rheumatology clinic will be underpinned by the code of practice, and so forth and so forth. And hopefully the idea was that you will have read through the Nurse and Midwifery Code of Practice prior to listening to me today, so you'll have some idea of some of the things that are on it. It is an extremely important piece of documentation for any nurse, and we are living under it on a day-to-day basis in all of our work. Even now, you might be surprised to know that as a lecturer here in Northern Regional College, I still adhere to the code of practice. I could lose my PIN number on my PIN if I did not adhere to this code. It's serious business. Later on in this lecture, that we might make referral to other people that maybe have not adhered to the code. And I can tell you that for doctors, nurses or social care workers, if we don't adhere to the code, then we can lose our registration and therefore, of course, lose our whole careers, our way of making money and such like, to feed our families. Okay, it is a very serious situation to be in. So let's have a look now at the code itself, and here it is. And this is what the code looks like. For those of you that have already clicked on the code prior to listening to this, you'll see that it looks like this. And the Nurse and Midwifery Council updated the code fairly recently in 2015. And the reason why they updated the code was because the old code was quite frankly out of date. And very similarly to your having to learn new ways of using technology, we live in a technological age now, and it is important for all health and social care practitioners, you're probably sick of hearing this, to be up to date in terms of technology. And the reason why the code was updated was because of that, because we've moved so far along in terms of technology that the old code needed to be rewritten in order to consider that. So our world now is almost dominated by social media, easy access to information, and the Nurse and Midwifery Code had to be updated in order to consider those sorts of things. Okay, you can see here that the code sets out universal standards expected of nurses and midwives, so that they must uphold in order to be registered to practice in the UK. So if we fail any aspect of this code in our day-to-day duties, we can be taken off the register, and that is a serious situation to be in. So all nurses from the day one of their training or their degree, it's really hammered home that we need to be upholding the values and the standards set out of this in this code of practice. And even if you leave nursing to become a lecturer in health and social care, we still are governed, if you like, by this code of practice. It is very important, as I said before. So let's have a look at it now. Okay, so you can see by this graphic here the reason why we need a code of practice. All right, so we need a code of practice, and the ultimate aim of a code of practice is to protect the public from us. Okay, and obviously we're dealing in very serious situations, often life and death situations, and we have to protect the public as far as we possibly or humanely can do in terms of our own humanity. And so this code is set out so that we can constantly keep it in the back of our minds, so that we ultimately protect the service users at every stage of their interaction with us. And you can see here that the code has got 4 themes. The first theme is to prioritise people. A lot of you might well have written about in your first assignment about person-centred care and the humanistic theory and how that underpins the person-centred care. And of course this is coming into this code already in the very first theme, because we have to prioritise people. And the next thing we have to do is practice effectively. I've sort of looking at that thinking to myself, well, of course we've got to practice effectively, because bless our cotton socks, as the NHS has got no money now, our budgets are getting smaller and smaller, so the only way to go is to practice very effectively in terms of that. But for the service users themselves, it's very important that we practice effectively to give them a good outcome, and that's what we're about. We're about patient outcome, service user outcome. We want them to have a good outcome so that they can live a decent quality of life. The next theme is to preserve safety, and you will already be completing a unit on health, safety and security, so you should know all about that. And the next and the very last theme is also very interesting, because the last theme of this code is to promote something called professionalism and trust. We need our patients or the service users, we need them to trust us. And this is at the heart of the communication process because, of course, we're looking at the code of practice today in terms of how it impacts on the communication process. So we need to use the code in order to underpin all of our communication processes, and of course one of those is to develop some trust, so that service users develop some trust in us. It is us, of course, who are suggesting how they might lead their lives, or we are in a position of having to implement some sort of care, and so they need to build up a trust in us. And those service users also need to gain confidence in us. We need to encourage them to confide in us, and we need to reassure those service users. And of course, we need to provide them with quite a lot of information. All of these processes are, of course, processes that we consider in terms of the communications that we interact with our service users, and so therefore you can see already how this code will impact on the communication process. Okay, onwards and upwards. The point of this lecture is to give you some pointers, really. So I'm going to look at the code, give you some pointers, and then it will be up to you to find and research some of the things you might have heard me say, and then hopefully you should be able to, by the end of this anyway, explain how this code impacts on the communication process in health and social care. That's the whole point of it. So let's go on with number 1. So hopefully you can see this, and this is just, you can see how the code is laid out here, and we've got the first theme here, and it says prioritize people. And it is suggestive of course, person-centered care. And then you've got a number of little like subheadings here, and the first one is all about treating people as individuals, and it makes a point of saying that in order to do that you've got to uphold their dignity. Now, before I go on and look at some of these points, which I will very quickly, you need to now consider dignity. And before we go on, I want you to do a little something. Hopefully you've got a piece of paper and a pen in front of you. And I want you to consider that if you were a patient in a surgical ward and you've just undertook, been in for an operation to remove your appendix, say, write this word down, dignity. And now, then write a few things that you would suggest would be to preserve your dignity in that situation. So you're coming round from anaesthetic, you're a little bit groggy. What would you want the nurse to do or the doctors to do to preserve your dignity? I'll give you about a minute now to write those down. Okay guys, so you've had a minute and hopefully you've written down or at least thought of some of the things you would want to happen in order to preserve your dignity. I can give you some examples. So a lot of you might say that you want to remain covered. And that's the obvious thing. You want all your body to remain covered. You don't want to be exposed in any way. Another one of you might have thought, well, I've seen those wee videos on Facebook when somebody comes around from a wisdom tooth extraction. I really would hate it if I came across to people like that, if I screamed out or hit out or whatever. And I would hope that somebody would be there to reassure me, keep me calm, these kind of things. And you can see automatically, even before we've got through the very first point of the NMC code of practice, that all of these things, in order to preserve somebody's dignity, we need to use communication. Okay? And the other thing is, before we've even got to that point, is that I asked you to write down what you considered to be dignified in that situation. And I could guess that many of you will have written different things. And so at the crux of the matter is, before we even go on, and in order to prioritise a person or a service user, and in order to treat that person and uphold their dignity, you guys have to know them. This is the single most important thing that you can do if you work in health and social care, is get to know your patient, get to know your service user, get to know who you're dealing with. And the only way that you can do that is with communication processes. Okay, so that's your first job before you've even done anything else. All right, and the only way you can prioritize a person or an individual is to get to know them. Okay, so you can see here how the code's written out. You've got lots of different points here. In your assignment, you can refer to point 1.4, if you like, of the code states that, and you can give me a quote or us a quote, and then you can go on and then suggest how that might impact on the communication processes. So here we go, on to the next bit. If I can get it to come up. There we go, here we go. Yes, the next one. Okay then. So this is the second point in the NMC code. I've left quite a bit of it out, by the way, so you can look at it yourself. But I found this one interesting because the first thing as well, one of the first things I suggested there to do was to get to know a patient or a service user. And the only way you could do that is to listen to people. Now, this is very obviously impacts on the communication process. Part of the communication process is something called active listening. And if at the end of this lecture you want to do a little bit more and look at active listening, I've actually put a couple of links up after this video on active listening techniques. It's actually, active listening is quite a difficult skill to learn, and it does take you some years to feel quite confident in terms of your active listening capabilities. Okay, the obvious place where active listening is as a skill is needed is in mental health situations and mental health environments. Okay, so you can look that up if you want. So now then, before we go on to the next bit, and I've talked to you about active listening, which is obviously impacts on the communication process. It does actually say here 2.1. It says you must, as in this case as a nurse, you must work in partnership with people to make sure you deliver care effectively. So this is one of these pointers that you can look at. You can look at how this impacts on the communication process, okay? And you might have heard of this before, where health and social care workers have to act in partnership. But you have to actually consider the relationship you have with a service user or a patient. Now, I've put a link up to World Health Organization website that explains different models of the patient-professional relationship, and some of you might want to go and look at those. It's very interesting. But if we consider for a wee minute the paternalistic model of the patient-professional relationship, which some of you might want to look up, then often the best interest of the patient in this case is judged as being more valuable to everyone involved if any decisions are made by a clinician, a doctor or a specialist nurse. Think about every time you visited the GP surgery. The GP is in a position of power really, because he has all the knowledge, if you like. So this is another aspect of how this code impacts on the communication process. We have to be very aware of this situation of the patient practitioner relationship. We have to make sure it's of an equal value, if you like, and this is a very, very difficult skill to achieve. There are other models that you can look at about the patient practitioner relationship. You could consider the informative model. Now this sees the patient or the service user as a consumer. A lot of you could argue whether that was quite a good thing or not. And of course, I've only given you 2 examples of different models of patient practitioner relationships, but there are more which you can look up. And of course, it depends on your approach as a practitioner. Depending on your approach as a practitioner, whether you see a paternalistic relationship or whether you see an informative relationship, this will impact on the communication processes in the health and social care workplace. Okay, so yeah, that link, I put up a link to the World Health Organization Patients' Rights webpage. It's available on the DLE for you, so you can look at that. But the point I'm trying to make is, I guess, that we need to empower people to make informed decision making about their own care. Okay, we've got to also recognize the contribution that the service user or the patient can actually make in their own care, and we do this with processes of communication, of course. Now another pointer I can point you to is the patient being an expert patient. This is very interesting in contemporary times, because every patient that ever goes to a GP at any time has Google Doc'd. We called it Google Doc. They've Google Doc'd their own condition and probably not understood any of it, and is likely to have some sort of an opinion on what they think should happen with their care. Okay. Now the other side to expert patient situation is that people with chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes, they often are very well informed about their condition, and so therefore we have to acknowledge them as the expert patient and understand that they can make quite informed decisions about their own care. Okay, and again, on the DLE after this, you will see that I've put up some information on the expert patient for any of you who would like to look at that and consider how that impacts on the communication processes. Some doctors would actually say that it's an absolute nightmare having expert patients because they make assumptions as to what their care should be, and perhaps we can't deliver it. Okay, very similarly to this one, it says here that in point number 3 of the NMC code, it says that we have to act in partnership with those who are receiving care. It's a very similar theme. We have to give them some proper information so that they can make these informed decisions, okay? And we'd often do this. All of you who are going on or are currently working in health and social care will be aware that a large part of your day includes patient education, okay? You've got to educate the patient or the service user, I apologise, how best for them to manage their own condition or situation in terms of social work. And the way you can do that is by giving them all the information they need, which means that you automatically have become an educator, like Moira or I or Anne or Ema. We are educators. And it might surprise you to know that these classes are not done just on the spur of the moment. I'm actually sitting here surrounded by pieces of paper. I have made a plan of what I should be telling you. I've made a plan on the activities that I'm giving you. And you as a health and social care practitioner, you also should be making plans of how you're going to deliver your patient education. And it could be something as simple as teaching somebody how to change a stoma bag, or teaching a teenage parent some parenting skills. It could be anything. And so the process of educating people has, it has its basis, or it's most certainly underpinned by communication. So you can think about that if you like. I've actually just had a wee look here, and you can just about see on point 3.4 it asks us as practitioners to act as advocates for vulnerable people, and we are meant to be challenging poor practice and discriminatory attitudes. Of course, all of this requires some communication somewhere. Now, as a wee bit of an aside, you'll be delighted to know in your second year of your HNC, you will be completing further units. One is working in partnership, and that will look at anti-discriminatory practice. So, and that also comes up a little bit on your principles unit. So you could hopefully by now be able to see how all these units link together. Okay, yes. Point number 5 now, we have to respect people's right to privacy and confidentiality. All right. Now, so this point is, of course, about confidentiality. And this is quite interesting now in today's times. Sorry, apologies if you can hear me rattling pieces of paper here. But as a healthcare worker, even under common law, you are actually allowed to breach confidentiality in the public interest. So in the investigation or punishment of a crime, for example, if somebody came in and they were a victim of domestic abuse, that might be a crime, and it gets quite interesting whether or not you breach confidentiality there or not. But confidentiality tends to relate to respecting anything that relates to an individual, a service user, and to all NHS organisations or any health and social care organisations. The information which is communicated to us about the people in our care, those people in our care, we should trust us to be able to keep that information confidential. Now, for any of you who might want to go forward with this and might decide that this is a point you want to look at as part of your assignment, you can actually find lots of newspaper articles and this is something that happened only last year, I believe, where we were in a situation where the NHS itself was hacked, and all the data in the NHS about patients' data was hacked. It was a serious situation, and obviously that was a massive, massive breach of confidentiality. And in terms of legislation, this does, of course, come under the Data Protection Act as well. So you can link this one to legislation if you like. Okay. So you can look at confidentiality in situations of how it's difficult. This is one part of the code that you can sort of go to town on a wee bit in your assignment, because there are situations where you feel you might need to breach confidentiality. And you have to share, it says here, you've got to share necessary information with other healthcare professionals. And that will get us into some quite difficult situations. These difficult situations are called ethical dilemmas, and you can look them up in terms of communication, and hopefully you'll find something nice to be able to write about in your assignment on confidentiality and ethical dilemmas. Okay then, of course, part of the NMC code is you must communicate clearly. Later on in this slideshow, I think maybe even in the next bit, there is a slide that is an example of somebody not communicating clearly. It's coming up in about 3 slides. Now, this one's quite interesting, because even in the process of delivering this lecture, I've resorted to abbreviations. I have maybe said some words that some people might not understand. Nurses are notorious for making sort of like shortened versions of words, and speaking in shorthand is what I'm trying to say. And this is a massive, massive problem in the NHS anyway. I'm not sure what it's like for social workers. You can ask some of the social work lecturers whether this is just as bad, but we do have to very much speak clearly. Now then, this one here, it says here under 7.5, and it says that nurses and midwives must be able to communicate clearly and effectively in English. Now, we might end up with a problem, because at the moment we are suffering a massive shortage of nurses in the NHS, partly because we're not paid enough, I might add. And so therefore we're relying on nurses from other countries to come in to staff the NHS. However, the code says we've got to be able to communicate clearly and effectively in English. So we have a problem there. So you can look into this problem. This is a problem and a wee bit of a dilemma that we face here. What do we do? Do we turn away thousands of Filipino and Indian nurses because they can't communicate effectively in English, or as effectively as we think that they should? I leave that question for you. Okay. All right then. Now this one here says we have to work cooperatively, and students, this is for you. Now, there's a lot of opinions on this this unit being delivered online, and the only way you're going to make this better is by working cooperatively. Okay, you need to collaborate, and you need to take the bull by the horns and have a go at some of the activities we've put out for you. Moira put some Padlets up. I attempted a wiki that went down like a lead balloon, but this time I'm trying to put up a forum for you, and I want you to all give it a go. The only way you're going to get better educated is by sharing information. Okay, so you can look at this, and of course this does underpin the communication process, hopefully cross-campus, so that the youth students in Newton Abbey will work cooperatively with my students in Coleraine. So that was a bit of an interesting bit of code there for you to look at. Okay, this point is actually, it's talking about multidisciplinary work, and there are barriers to multidisciplinary teamwork. One of the major barriers is not communicating effectively, guys. Okay, so yes, seems okay. Reading that we should work cooperatively, but one of the massive barriers to this is not communicating properly. And the mere notion of a multidisciplinary team in any of the services that we provide suggests that each team member actually does a different job. So we might have occupational therapists, we might have physios, we might have social workers, we might have nurses, we might have care workers, and we might have the person themselves, the service user themselves. And the point is that I'm trying to make is, again, you have to use communication processes to understand the roles of each individual team member. This is a massive barrier to good quality teamwork if people don't understand the roles and if they don't communicate effectively with them. Okay, so you can look at that. Yes, so this one's interesting, and the only reason I put this up is that nurses nowadays have to revalidate their careers. They have to update their knowledge on a 3-yearly basis, if not constantly all the time, and they have to complete quite a formal revalidation process. Part of that revalidation process is the ability and the skill to be able to reflect on your work. And the only reason I've left this one in here is because if you're wondering why we keep giving you reflective assignments, like your first communication assignment was, well, this is the reason why, because you as a health and social care practitioner must be able to reflect on your own work, and in order to do so you must be able to write down that reflection and communicate that you understand what that means. Now then, the last thing that we're going to look at now is in terms of the communication processes of the NMC code is number 10 states that you must keep clear and accurate records relevant to your practice. This is across the board in health and social care, guys. You've got to be able to keep clear and accurate records relevant to your practice, and I've got an example here of one that isn't quite so clear, and even if I was to zoom in on that, I can assure you wouldn't understand a word that's saying. This is an example of bad, poor record keeping. It's worth mentioning again, if we want to link to legislation, that record keeping, most certainly for nurses and social workers, they are legal documents. So every time you put pen to paper, you're writing a legal document, and those documents can be brought up in a court of law 10 years after you've written them. That is a sobering thought, everybody, and it certainly keeps us on our toes when we're actually keeping the records. Okay, guys, that's it. Enough. I think this is far too long, maybe already, but you can dip in and out of it, hopefully. The last thing I want to do is to point you towards this. Hopefully you've figured out by now what I'm like. I do like you to answer questions on the little surveys that I put up. They tend to be Survey Monkey, guys. Please will you answer them, and when I say please, can I please ask all the students to answer the surveys on this communication unit from all campuses. This is so very important. The only way we can go forward as teachers to see are we doing a good job or not such a good job is by gaining some sort of evaluation on how we're going. So please answer the survey. Please have a go at the forum, and hopefully I've put all sorts of pieces of information on this section for you, that you will be able to access further information. I'm hoping that by now you should be able to explain how codes of practice, in this case nurse and midwifery code, impacts on the communication process. So thank you for listening, folks, and I'll see you next week.